McMasters is going to come. She's going to give us a very good, quick education on the Constitution and why your sheriff is so important. Then our candidates are going to come give you a brief introduction because we got a time issue. And then she's going to go over some questions with them to find out where they stand. And this is very important because the sheriff is the most powerful person in your county. Does everyone know that? Yeah, it's an important thing. So Christin, come on up. Right, I give you Christin McMasters. You'll enjoy it.
Awesome. Okay, so I recognize some of you, but most of you I don't recognize, which is awesome. But also, I've got a lot to go over in a very short time because I don't like to talk about things like the sheriff unless I've really given you guys a firm foundation. So a little information about me. I have a Ph.D. in political science. I am a college instructor. I teach American government, but I'm not like your typical academics because I love our country. I love the Constitution, and I'm incredibly passionate about helping the American citizenry actually know the Constitution, right? So we're going to start real big, and then we're going to get real small, okay? So we're going to start big and get all the way down to the sheriff so that by the time we're talking to the sheriffs, we have context. Okay. So I want to really briefly, I'm going to go through this fast because I don't have a lot of time. This is like a 45-minute talk that I'm going to try to do in about 20 minutes, okay? So bear with me. But the number one thing I start all of my talks with is the fact that when I was in college, I used to always talk about the Constitution and the importance of the Constitution, right? How badly our government needs to follow the Constitution, right? How many of you feel that in your gut? You feel the government should follow the Constitution, right? The problem is, as I was thinking that, if I were to ask myself why the government should follow the Constitution, I would struggle to answer that question, right? How many of you could clearly and articulately put to me why it matters for our government to follow that Constitution? Rule of law? Okay. This is important, right? If we don't know the answer to this, we can't very well interact with people around the country or our actual politicians and hold them accountable to something we don't know why they need to follow. So my goal is to give y'all a foundation, right? We need a foundation. We're going to go over this big, broad, theoretical stuff fast and work our way to the sheriff so that you understand why it's important they follow the Constitution. All right. So if you can go to my first slide, that'd be great. Okay. So we're going to go through 4 questions. Then we'll get to some other questions. First one is, why do we have government? How many of you have thought that to yourself before? Important question, right? Because if you don't know the answer, you can't critique what government's doing because you don't know what it's supposed to do, right? The answer to this question is going to change depending on where you live. If you live in China, you're going to get a different answer. We live in the United States. We're going to talk about the answer to that question for the United States. Why do we actually have a constitution? Why should our government follow the Constitution? And then finally, what does the Constitution actually say? All right, next slide. Like I said, I'm going through this very fast. So the first question is, why do we have government? Anybody want to give me one? I'm just going to do short little answers. Any guesses why we have government? Yeah. Protect our rights? Yeah. God-given? One more. Safety. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so I'm going to give you theory, real fast theory. This is like I'm giving you basically a college level political science class in 20 minutes, so bear with me. All right, so theory, Locke, Hobbes. You guys heard of Locke and Hobbes? Yes, okay. They introduced the idea that without government or society per se, we all live in what they call a state of nature. Now, a state of nature can be problematic because in a state of nature, Hobbes introduces that idea that we have a right to any and everything. Now, I hope you guys, somebody over here said God-given rights. So here's the thing about rights. Back when this was written, there was no such thing as rights. Can any of you bring your rights to me and put them right here? Why? It's an idea, right? And ideas only have power if they're given power in our minds, right? This idea had not materialized yet. In fact, in that day and age, think about it. There was a king, there was a monarch. Was there such a thing as you having a right to anything? No. So this idea that you have a right to anything and everything was never happened before, right? First time ever. Very original. Okay, so Hobbes introduces this idea that we have a right to any and everything. The problem is, if you have a right to any and everything, and so do I have a right to your clothes, your phone, your food, right? And people are going to be selfishly pushing for what they want to survive. So we devolve into the state of chaos and anarchy, hence a state of war. Now, Locke says, I want to be a little more reasonable about it, and I'm going to introduce this idea of private property. How many of y'all know or have heard of that, private property? Yeah, it's a very American thing, okay? Now, back in the day, though, in the 15 and 1600s, do you think anyone had private property? No. So this is, I want to emphasize this. I try to emphasize this to my students. The fact that we're familiar with that is in itself a blessing, right? And Locke said, private property is the labor of our hands, the fruit of our labor, and our body, okay? I had a French student, one of my classes, and that French student, she was unfamiliar with the idea of private property. This is uniquely American. So Locke says, that with this idea of private property, the problem is, say I have an apple tree, this apple falls down, you steal it, I can do whatever I want to punish you for stealing my property, right? There's no government, so if I believe that death is your punishment, death is your punishment. I am the final source of all law, right? I'm the judge, jury, and executioner. Okay. So what ends up happening is we bump into each other as these mini governments, and this devolves into another state of war. So we need to fix this problem, and we enter into, collectively as a society, something called a social contract. Now, how many of you have heard of a social contract? Some of you? Okay. So a social contract is this idea that I'm going to give up some of my rights to some things as long as you give up some of your rights to some things, right? Problem is, who's to hold us accountable to this? No one. So what do? We create government. Can you go to the next slide? So why do we have government in this country? Very simple, okay? To protect us and our private property from each other. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, here's the problem. I really want to insert this word back into the political conversation. Arbitrary. How many of y'all have heard of that word? Okay, critical word. It's the word that the founders used frequently. So we have this situation. We need government because we have this selfish group of people that need some sort of protection from each other, right? We take these same people and we put them in positions of power. See the problem? So what are we going to do with that? We don't want people that can do whatever they want with us now that they have more power. They're no better than they were before. So can you go to the next slide? Arbitrary power. Arbitrary power is this idea of power that comes from nowhere. Power that comes from nowhere is undefined and unconfined, right? An example of an arbitrary power leader throughout history could be Queen Elizabeth, not currently, but Queen Elizabeth in the past. It's weird, right? You think of her as somebody great. Problem was, her power was subject to her goodwill. She could have used that power for bad. Probably did sometimes. Somebody else could be arbitrary. King Henry VIII. Was he the one who killed all his wives? Arbitrary power. This means that the government has all authority to do whatever they want to you. And what can you say? If the king says off with your head, off with your head. We don't want that, right? That's what the founders wanted to avoid. So let's go to the next slide. Can you click again? So we create government to protect us and our private property from each other, right? Can you click again? So what protects us and our private property from government? It's a good question, right? Next slide. Why do we have a constitution? All right, so think of it this way. We created government to do a job for us, yes? We pay them, yes? So who's the employer in this scenario? We are. Who's the employee? How many employees do you hire and not give them a job description? Right? And yet, how many of us, when we put government officials, politicians into their position, expect them to have a job description. Let me ask you this. How many people in government are going to be motivated to know or follow their job description if we don't know it? Right? We're the employer. Are we effective employers? It's important. So, the Constitution literally gives our government power because it defines and therefore confines for government exactly what it's supposed to do. This is, I wish I could emphasize to you how radical this is, because there's something that actually tells government no. Throughout history, that's not even heard of, right? So why do we have a constitution? Because our Constitution protects us and our private property from government. Where does our government get its power from? It gets its power from the Constitution. Therefore, its power is not arbitrary. It can't just do whatever it wants, right? But government's gonna push to do whatever it wants if we don't know what that Constitution says. So this is why my passion is to arm you with information so that when you look at your employee, you know what they're supposed to do. Because let me tell you, they don't want you to know. They don't even know, right? So let's go to the next. So the Constitution literally governs our government, which is amazing. It is a standard outside of government. Can you go to the next slide? So this should be intuitive. Why does it matter if the government follows our Constitution? Can you go to the next slide? The government actually derives its power from the Constitution. Therefore, if it does something outside of the Constitution, where does it get the power to do what it just did? Nowhere. And if it gets that power from nowhere, what does that mean about its power? It's unlimited. If they can do that one thing, they can do anything. Put it this way. If the government, the FBI, raid your house one night, you know this is unconstitutional, so what do you appeal to? The Constitution, right? Imagine this happens, the FBI raids your house one night, and there is no Constitution. Right? Let's go to the next page. So without the Constitution governing our government, to whom do we appeal to protect us from government? Nothing. It is arbitrary. So let's go to the next slide. I'm whizzing through this here. Okay. I'm going to briefly touch on one part of the Constitution, and then I'm going to touch on the sheriff's role at the end. But I need to give you this context first. So you guys know Article 1, Section 8. Anyone know Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution? One person? Okay. This is important, right? We're government's employees or employers. They're our employee, right? We should know what they're supposed to do. Article 1, Section 8 is the most critical part of the Constitution. Why? Because it defines the powers of Congress. Let's go to the next page. You can click like 2 times once you get there. So why is Congress considered the preeminent branch? I want to kind of shatter an illusion that these are co-equal branches, because they're not, all right? The founders created our government with one branch that had most of the power, the branch that's most connected to the people, right? That is the legislative branch. The legislative branch is the most important branch. Why? Because it's the branch that makes law. Laws that protect us and our private property from each other. It's the whole point of government. What does the executive branch do? Execute law. What would the executive branch do without a legislative branch making law? Nothing. The judicial branch applies law. What would they do without the legislative branch? Nothing. Where this branch goes, the rest of government goes, okay? So we better know what they're doing, and we're the ones that are directly connected to them. Aside from Congress, how many people do we elect in the federal government, aside from Congress? 2. That's it. The president and the vice president. Think of all the executive branch agencies, all of your judges and justices, not a single one of them elected by us. Only the legislature is held directly accountable to us. and the president and the vice president. So we better know what they're supposed to make laws about. So let's go to the next page. All right. We're going to move through this really fast. So these are the enumerated powers of Congress. Context, the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation before the new Constitution bred a lot of anarchy and chaos in the states, okay? So the founders wanted to have a stronger federal government because they knew that the country could essentially implode because there was so much chaos and anarchy, right? And so this is about, think of these in terms of the states versus the federal government. Anything not listed here is left to the states. This is very important for our sheriffs and our local politicians to know. All right. So therefore, it's very important for you to know, since you're the ones holding them accountable to their job, right? So first of all, power to lay and collect taxes. This should be a federal power because we're paying them as our employee to do a job for us, obviously. So borrow money on credit. I like to at least see if somebody can guess this. Why was this left to the federal government? Hard to guess. Would we want North Carolina borrowing money on credit and South Carolina borrowing money on credit from China, North Carolina from Russia? No. So this was left to the union of the states to make this decision on, right? Think of it in these terms. Think of it vertical power. We're used to horizontal power. Think of it as vertical power. Okay. Regulate commerce with foreign nations and among states. So this was left to the federal government because there was a lot of problems across states dealing with commerce. To establish uniform rules of naturalization, that basically just means immigration, which should be intuitive because it would be difficult to have people become American citizens if you could only do it in one state, right? To coin money and regulate the value thereof. We don't want different currencies across states. That gets complicated and chaotic. Let's go to the next page. Punish counterfeiting. If it's a federal job to create the money, then it's a federal crime to counterfeit that money. And think of it in terms, think of this. Federal laws, you can only, let me put it this way, you can only break a law and commit a crime if there's a law to break, right? So just keep that in mind as we go through this list of powers given to our Congress about which they can make law. Nothing else can they make laws about, only these topics. Make sense? So this is really important because the states are the ones that have powers for anything not listed here. To establish post offices and roads, better be done by one big government than trying to do this across multiple state governments. To issue patents and copyrights to inventors and authors. This is important. Why? Because, yes, property. We need to allow innovation. And if you have different states doing this across the board, this can get very confusing. To create courts inferior to the Supreme Court. So I would love to get into this a lot more, but the Constitution only creates one court. That's the Supreme Court. Congress creates all other courts, all right? Congress could strip the Supreme Court down to one person with a pencil and a piece of paper. That is how much power Congress has over the courts. They decide their jurisdiction, aside from a very small amount of jurisdiction in Article 3. That's how much power. Why? Because we don't elect the courts. We elect Congress. Right? We get that mixed up. We a lot of times think of the courts as far more powerful than Congress, but Congress is far more powerful than the courts. Define and punish piracies. Now, my students tend to think of this as like stealing movies or something like that. I don't know why, because clearly back in the 1700s, they couldn't steal movies. Piracies just means crimes on the seas, right? So the federal government is going to say this is a federal crime if you commit it on the seas because it's hard to figure out which part of the ocean is left to the states. Okay, to fix the standard of weights and measures, we have the imperial system here. That's across the board for every state. To declare war. Now, I could get into this a whole lot more, but basically we don't want South Carolina declaring war or Maine declaring war and the rest of the states not really on board, right? Okay, hopefully this is making intuitive sense. We can go to the next. To raise and support armies, to maintain and provide for the Navy. To raise basically means by law create, and to support means to by law fund. So our federal government, this was a debate because armies had been used in history as oppressive forces for government. So they weren't really all on board with this idea of having a standing army, but they also knew that the country would be open to invasion if they didn't. So this standing army and navy was provided for. Congress has the power to create it. The militia clauses here, there's a lot to this that I could unpack. I don't have time to unpack it. But the debate about the militia has been, what's the militia today? Classically speaking, it was a state militia. It was made up of regular average citizens who had been trained in arms, men who had other occupations, would be called into action when needed and go back to their occupations when finished. Today, it basically means, some people say the National Guard, some people say the armed citizenry, some people say just some of the state militia. But essentially, if there is an insurrection within the country itself, Congress has the ability to call forth this militia. Finally, exercise legislation over all places purchased by government. This just basically means that any part of the United States mainland that is owned by the federal government, Washington, D.C., is subject to federal law. Okay, let's go to the next page. So this part, how many of you have heard of necessary and proper clause? 1, 2, okay. It's commonly used by politicians to justify arbitrary power, right? But if you look at it in the context, it says to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for the carrying into execution of the what? Foregoing powers. Now, everything we just went through, were those laws? No, they were powers. Remember, job description, okay? Hey, government, you can make laws about these things. We've empowered you via the Constitution to make laws about these things and nothing else. The states take everything else, okay? Foregoing powers. Let's go to the next slide. These are enumerated powers. They are delegated to the legislature. The legislature can only make laws about these specific topics. Let's go to the next slide. Madison said this, the powers of the federal government are enumerated. It can only operate in certain cases. It has legislative powers on defined and limited objects beyond which it cannot extend its jurisdiction. Let's go to the next slide. You can just click. So tell me where healthcare or education or welfare or marriage, Social Security, you can go back, local business regulation, police, drug policy, any of that. Not there. Where does our government get the power to do this then? Yeah. How many of these things did we demand? The people. Yeah. We didn't know. They don't want us to know. How many people in government do you think actually know this? Not many, right? But they don't want to know it because why would they care to know it if we don't know it? Right? It increases their power. Yeah, this is arbitrary power. So let's go to the next page. This is why I'm passionate, because I was at it's 8:13, so I'm gonna try to hurry up here. So I was at it was a panel kind of like this, where there were 5 senatorial candidates, all right? And the senatorial candidates for our state, okay, to go up to Washington, D.C., were answering questions from a Republican audience, okay? And a gentleman came up and asked them, do you know how many powers you have in Article 1, Section 8? It's important, right? This is their literal job description. They better know it, and we better want them to know it, because it confines their power. Guess what happened? They laughed, and the crowd laughed. Nobody cared. It wasn't a cool, emotional issue. One of the candidates attempted to answer incorrectly. That was it. The next lady that came up to ask a question said, how are you going to fix the education department? See the problem? 4 of them answered as if it was within their job description. One of them stood up and said, sorry, that's a state power. They weren't motivated to know this, though, because the crowd didn't know it. This is why I'm passionate, because I see my students change when I tell them this, because this is not a partisan thing. This is a unifying thing. No one, aside from government, wants an arbitrary, unconfined government, right? So, all right, I'm going to try to close with this. We're going to speed through this. 8:15. Okay. So I really want to clarify, because moving into the sheriffs and their powers, you need to know the difference between the Constitution, because we're going to be talking about the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Now, the Bill of Rights We tend to conflate with the Constitution. How many of you, when you talk about the Constitution, you think of the Bill of Rights, right? The Bill of Rights were amendments to the Constitution. Here's the thing. The founders were more interested in liberty than rights. Rights can get messy. You can have a right to a house, a right to a Nintendo, a right to a phone, right? And the more rights you have, guess what you need more of? Government, right? We want liberty, and the Constitution protects liberty. So let's go to the next slide. This is a lot to read, but I got to read it to you. I hope this fundamentally changes and alters the way you see government, so that when we see these officials up here, it changes that as well. So in sum, the Constitution's framers thought that a Bill of Rights was appropriate for what? Unlimited government, but not for a limited one like the national government created by the Constitution. The Constitution accordingly sought to secure liberty through enumerations of powers to the government rather than through enumerations of rights to the people. It remains a government of limited and enumerated powers, so that the first question involving an exercise of federal power is not whether it violates someone's rights, but whether it exceeds the national government's enumerated powers. How many of you, when you look at our government's behavior, think to yourself, my right's been violated, versus have they violated their job description? Right? Big difference. Let's go to the next slide. Hamilton put it this way, because Hamilton didn't want the Bill of Rights. He said, the Bill of Rights would contain various exceptions to powers not granted, and on this very account would afford a colorable pretext to claim more than were granted. For why declare that things shall not be done, which there's no power to do? Why tell our government it can't do something it already couldn't do? In that list of powers that we went through, was there any chance that our government could violate your free speech or your guns? No. But we've been so preoccupied over here with the rights, as if we only have 10 rights, that we miss what's happening over here. So here's the thing, if government starts getting to these, what have they done to this? They've shredded it, right? This protects liberty. This limits government's power. It says, government, no. This is all you can do. Those Bill of Rights says, government, you can do anything but. Big difference. Let's go to the next slide. You can go to the next slide. So the Bill of Rights is a fail-safe to our Constitution. Let's go to the next slide. The problem is that the Supreme Court, don't even want to get started on the Supreme Court, has been very fond of arguments that run something like, all self-respecting governments can do X. Our national government is a self-respecting government. Therefore, our national government can do X. What kind of power is that? Arbitrary. So let's go to the next page. In modern times, the enumerated powers of the national government have been misread beyond all recognition, to the point that the actual Constitution is not really part of the governing structure at all. We live with a shadow or a zombie Constitution that has the outer husk of the original document, but none of its actual substance. These quotes come from a professor of law up in Boston University, right? Let's go to the next slide. We can go to the next one. I'm trying to speed through this. So my goal in what I'm doing is to help arm citizens with this knowledge so that you actually can be an effective employer and hold government officials accountable. Because let me tell you, in any speech I give, the only people giving me eye daggers are politicians. Because they don't like me, right? Because guess what I'm doing? Who am I empowering? Yeah. We get it mixed up. We think they're boss. No, guess what? We employed them to do a job for us, right? It's our job to vet them, which is what we're doing tonight. So let's move on to the next slide. So our job is to know this Constitution, this job description, so that we can keep them, our government officials, and ourselves accountable to it. Now, we can't violate the Constitution, but we got to make sure they don't violate the Constitution, so we better know it. Now let's move on to the next slide. So I already had this here, which is perfect because I moved from broad to small. This is why our local politicians better know their realms of power, right? The state has a constitution that confines and defines it. There are charters for local governments, and then there's the federal government's constitution. If our local governments know the job of the federal government versus their job, they're the ones that can tell the federal government no. Unfortunately, most local governments and state governments are hooked on federal money. That's a whole nother story. So let's go to the next page. So the sheriff's position, very literally, and I've been talking to some retired sheriffs and some retired detectives to get help with this presentation because it's so important. And what they tell me is the sheriff's position very literally is the last line of defense we have here in this country. Now, sheriff comes from the derivative, it's shire reeve. It's the 9th century, I believe, in England. There was a reeve, R-E-E-V-E, who was technically sort of an overlord of a shire in England. And he was more or less the king's agent, making sure that people paid their taxes, so on and so forth. It eventually kind of evolved and became the sheriff. And now we have sheriffs today, which in the United States are not like shire reeves, right? They're not agents of the king. So the unique thing about the sheriff is I actually have been calling it the sheriff's department, and I was wrong. It's the office of the sheriff. Now, why is that so important? Anybody know? It's elected. You have a police department, an education department. Departments are specific government agencies that are hired and employed by government agencies and are subject to anyone in charge of them, right? They have someone that they're subordinate to. They can be hired or fired by. The office of the sheriff, not so. It is the only law enforcement office that is created explicitly by the Constitution of our state. It's nowhere in the federal Constitution, but it is in the Constitution of our state that creates this office. It is an office, not a department. So the North Carolina Constitution merely creates the office and really doesn't give any more detail than that it exists. And there are certain regulations on who can run for office. Now I'm going to read this to you. This is statutes per the North Carolina General Assembly. They have written a statute defining some of the jobs of the sheriff. Okay, so let's read this together. You guys are going to get a little sort of boost. So if I ask you your job, you're already going to know it, see? So per NCGE 17E, that just means North Carolina General Assembly, the sheriff, in addition to his criminal justice responsibilities, is the only officer who is also responsible for the courts of the state and acting as their bailiff and marshal. The sheriff administers and executes criminal and civil justice and acts as the ex officio detention officer. Now, the thing about the sheriff is he's not accountable to any direct boss. Who's his boss? We are via what? The Constitution, and that's critical, right? Because we're not a democratic republic. Because the democratic republic, what does that mean? Who's the final say? People. And guess what people do sometimes? Really bad things, right? Founders knew that. We are a constitutional republic, meaning what's the final say? Constitution. So that means if we demanded, the people popularly demanded to put Japanese Americans in internment camps, guess what? The government should say no, because the Constitution should protect us from ourselves as well, right? In the same way, the sheriff, he is empowered by the people via the Constitution. Okay, let's go to the next page. We don't necessarily have to go through all this. This is just we can maybe touch base on this when I start talking to y'all, but this is a more or less detailed, expansive, sort of detailed, what is the word I'm looking for? Description of the sheriff's office. So let's go to the next page. So the thing I want to kind of hone in on is that the sheriff holds a very juxtapositional role. What do I mean by that? This is something that kind of blows my mind. His oaths are to maintain both the North Carolina and United States Constitution, as well as the laws that are not inconsistent with those constitutions, right? So he is the law. The sheriff represents law. We need law and order, as we talked about. Otherwise, we devolve into chaos, right? So we need government. However, he is the law, and yet he's also supposed to protect us from the law. You get that? that's a hard position. That's a weighty burden to carry, right? And that's why I want to emphasize this to our candidates. That is a grave burden to carry. Because you are actually empowered to not only stand for the law, but have such a reverence and respect for the law above that law, that you will be willing to protect us from yourselves and from the government itself. A sheriff can be a tyrant's best asset or a tyrant's worst enemy. So with that, we're gonna come up here. We're gonna have our sheriff candidates come up.
If y'all aren't scared, come on up after that. If y'all aren't scared to run after that, come on. I might back out after that. We are only going to have time to say your name, get on to the questions, but they want to help. All right, so just say your name.
I'm Adam Moore. I'm running for Guilford County Sheriff.
I'm Phil Bird, and I'm running for Guilford County Sheriff.
William White, same thing.
Edward Melvin, Guilford County Sheriff.
And Billy Queen, Guilford County Sheriff.
Okay, this is amazing. I'm so excited to talk to y'all. So, like I said, the office of the sheriff is something that I was less familiar with. So I started talking with people who had been sheriffs and detectives so that I could really kind of dig in and what it means to be the sheriff. So they helped me come up with some of these questions. So we'll see how this goes. So I think I'm going to skip you explaining or if you know your job description because we kind of just went through that, right? But that is important. So the first question I wanted to ask is what you believe qualifies you to run for the office of sheriff. So you want to go?
For the last 7 years, or do I need to stand up or sit down? I'll sit down. Okay, I've been working in law enforcement for the last 7 years. I've been through numerous trainings. I've never been disciplined or anything such as that, and I believe that's what qualifies me for sheriff.
I retired in 2014 after 30 years with the Guilford County Sheriff's Office, holding positions from a detention officer to command level officer for the last 10 years of my career. I was sworn in 9 times as a deputy sheriff. You're sworn in every time a sheriff is election. It doesn't matter if it's the same sheriff or not. We're the arm of the sheriff. We are acting in his place as a sheriff because he can't be everywhere. We have to act for him. I believe I've had the experience and I believe I've gained the knowledge. I understand the constitutional duties of the sheriff. I understand the transportation aspect, mental health patients. I understand the jail detention obligations. I understand the civil process and executions, levying on property. I understand those because I did it for so long. So I believe that if you have the culmination of experience and exposure, it does give you a lot of inside knowledge.
Similar to what these guys said, I have about 15 years law enforcement experience, both federal side and local side. A United States Marine Corps veteran, 2 combat tours, and I'll make this quick. Presidential service veteran with George W. Bush. I've served in many different roles, including community service roles, to a sniper on the SWAT team. I've done just about I've served in every area of Greensboro that you can serve. But ultimately, that doesn't matter. What qualifies me to be sheriff is you. You tell me if I'm qualified. You tell me if I'm allowed to sit up here, and you tell me if I'm allowed to run. So that's what qualifies me. Thank you.
Joined the United States Air Force as a military police. I was in the Air Force for 7 years, remained in military police for those 7 years. I got out, became a North Carolina state trooper. I retired from North Carolina State Highway Patrol, and I became the chief deputy for a short period of time. But I've resigned that position after the direction of the sheriff's office under this current sheriff was going against my principles. So after 11 weeks, I decided to leave. I could have stayed and draw a 6-figure salary, but I stand on my beliefs. And if it's going against my beliefs, I left.
Hello, everyone. I'm from Guilford County. I grew up here, graduated from Grimsley High School. I joined the United States Army right out of high school. I am a Vietnam veteran. I returned home, enrolled at Guilford College, earned my bachelor's degree in criminal justice, became a police officer with the High Point Police Department, first line supervisor sergeant there. I went from there to the United States Border Patrol, where I worked the southern border out in California. I went from there to the United States Justice Department's Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, where I worked the next 20 years. And I worked literally from one end of this country to the other. I worked in Bureau headquarters in the administrative section there. I represented ATF up on the Hill. I've also commanded ATF SRT Team 5 out of California, was responsible for all the high-risk operations in the western part of the United States. I was project officer in Bureau headquarters, developed a complete computer program for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which affected 1,200 agents in the field and another 500 support people around the United States. That makes me qualified.
Cool. So we can breathe a little bit. We have 30 minutes, so it's okay. So I do want to sort of just speak on behalf of the citizenry here in that we really want to know the reverence that you guys have for the rule of law and for the Constitution, right? So when I teach my students, one of the things I talk about is there's something called the spirit of the laws written by Montesquieu. I don't know if you've heard of him, but it's this love or respect of the law. And it's necessary for a republic or any sort of democratic institution to survive, right? And there's a lot of questions as to why and how has our Constitution been the longest living written document ever. There are constitutions better written than ours that are put in place in other countries and they fail within 10 years, right? And a lot of the reason that people introduce is the fact that there's an actual inherent love and respect for the Constitution in this country that's almost unexplainable. My French student was like, it blows my mind. I've never seen such a love and a passion in a citizenry for the founding and the Constitution, which is remarkable. So I know personally what I'm looking for that qualifies someone is, do I see a reverence and a gravity for the position and the role that you very literally as sheriff, you have almost arbitrary power over your county within that constitutional limitation, right? And if there's not that love and that respect for the Constitution, it can be taken and used and abused like that, right? So that's one of the things that I definitely look for. We'll see that as we go through these questions, kind of what is that love and affection that rises out of you towards that very thing that confines your power and protects us from those in power. How much is that important to you? Does that make sense? So, okay, so I've got some questions from some people in the audience. I don't know who wrote them. I'm going to sort of intersperse my questions with their questions, okay? So this is a question from the audience, and it says, will you not follow an unconstitutional order? So, and I know that's something a lot of people want to know. So maybe before you answer that question, I'm going to kind of lead in with one of my own questions, which is first, have you guys studied in full the U.S. Constitution and the state constitutions? And if you haven't, will you, and to piggyback off of that, will you require that your deputy sheriffs also study and know in full the state and federal constitutions?
So I believe that we're talking about the different mandates that we saw come across for the last few years. And that's actually what started me reading the North Carolina Constitution. It made me look at that, especially after what our governor done. Our governor signed a piece of paper stating that we could only be limited to how many people can show up, how many people can go somewhere. And if you read our North Carolina Constitution, he can only do that with the concurrence of the Council of State. And yet he chose to have a judge overturn the lawsuits to turn against that. So yes, I have read the Constitution of the United States and the North Carolina, because I know that's where we get our power from and our authority from. And no, there's no way that I would enforce any of that, because those mandates and those things that were enforced by him violate the First Amendment. You cannot violate where we can go and what we can do.
Yeah, the Constitution, most law enforcement officers that go through basic law enforcement training have courses on constitutional law. The Constitution, if we look at it clearly from the law enforcement aspect, like myself as a deputy sheriff, going over the Constitution's boundaries is very easy to do, because we're so limited actually by the power of the Constitution as a deputy sheriff. The spirit of law that that was mentioned just a moment ago by Dr. McMasters is something that we only enforce constitutional violations when there's laws attached to them that in state law we're bound to uphold the Constitution. We're sworn in, and when we're sworn in, we sign affidavits as deputy sheriffs to uphold the state Constitution and also uphold the federal Constitution. But it means to uphold. There's a fine line by enforcing any Constitution violations and protecting you, the citizens, from the Constitution. So the Constitution is something, there is laws we have to enforce. There's common law we have to enforce. But at the same time we have to protect the citizens from the overreach, because you're also protected by the Constitution. And as sheriffs and constitutional officers, we're lucky because we can go by the Constitution. We don't have the boss telling us to enforce constitutional violations that's not there. Mandates, I do not believe in health mandates. My job as a sheriff is not to enforce medical. It's not to enforce mask mandates. It's not to enforce any type of health department regulation, educational regulation that's dictated. That's not what the sheriff's job is, because it's not derived. It's not derived from the power of any of the governments to give me those type of mandates. And so I would not enforce any of them, same as the Second Amendment, which you may be some questions to that. You hear a lot of that now. I get a lot of questions about the Second Amendment. I will never, ever allow any gun confiscation, gun grabs, firearm grabs from law-abiding citizens. We do have to have laws that protect us. I don't want a neighborhood rapist to have a firearm. I do not want a pedophile that is in your neighborhood to be able to take advantage of your child by using a firearm. They don't need firearms, but law-abiding citizens should not be regulated by any type of firearm. It should not be any type of firearm that you're regulated not to have. So that's dealing more with your Second Amendment, but it's still, I have, as a sheriff, I do have powers that allow me to support the Constitution both ways, enforcing it and protecting it.
So I'm like a lot of law enforcement officers that were a little hesitant about the Constitution. They do go through in-service training. However, it's not enough. The Constitution is scary to a lot of public officials, law enforcement officers included. So what I did is went and got my bachelor's in law and policy. From there, I earned my master's in public policy. From there, I went on as a doctoral candidate to this summer, actually, to graduate with my doctorate in public administration and government. So it was a scary subject at first. I have a better grasp on it, but I still do not fully understand it. It is a very, very difficult document to fully grasp, but you can get the bread and the butter of it. There's a couple things that usually fly under the radar with this. We were just talking about mandates. You always hear that term, right, especially now, but you never hear any talk about the enforcement arm. Who is the enforcement arm for a mandate? Nobody ever says anything about it. They're sitting on this stage right now. That is the enforcement arm for your mandates. And if you have to ask them, get in their face and ask them, me included, and I love these guys. I'm not throwing shade. You have to ask those people that are pushing mandates down your throat and say, hey, who is enforcing this? Are you going to tell the sheriff's office to come knock down my door and arrest me? Is that what you're telling me? Ask them. Ask them who the enforcement arm is on any of these mandates. The Second Amendment. You know the Second Amendment. You would think it would never be touched. Unfortunately, it has been. CCPs. I am a firm believer in concealed carry. However, I take the road less traveled, and I do not believe in CCPs at all. It is just one more twist to your rights. That's all it is. I believe in responsible firearm ownership, concealed carry, and of course, the argument can be made, well, CCPs, you get better training with the firearm and things like that. There is a mountain of evidence that suggests constitutional carry states, meaning you do not need a CCP, constitutional carry states are safer. And so, and the last part of the question was, will we require deputies or any employee to have further constitutional training? It would be great, and I'm sure you've done it before. It'd be great to have you come in and teach them. And unfortunately, in service, the way it works, real quick, I won't bore you with how in service works. In service is kind of you're drinking from a fire hose, if you will. You get a lot of information coming in really fast, really quick, and sometimes it gets lost. I'm going to close on this. I would absolutely require more training on the Constitution if the people are okay with it. But I also want to tell you this. The sheriff's office, every law enforcement officer in the country is protected by something called government immunity. Now, we didn't have time tonight to go into the Supreme Court and how they sometimes make their own rules and laws. You are not protected by it. But anybody that dons that badge is protected by it. And it is a blank check to do what you want. The argument can be made, well, it's to protect against frivolous lawsuits. No, it's not. It's an absolute blank check, not just for law enforcement, but other politicians and elected officials. So your Constitution is being twisted right now. So it's really, really important that we get this right. I appreciate it.
I want to quote the part of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evidence, that all men are created equally. And through their creator, they're endowed with certain inalienable rights. And inalienable is important because inalienable means, it means that those rights cannot be taken away, transferred, or removed. So when they talk about unalienable rights, those are your rights that cannot be trampled on. And the reason I'm here is because of the Constitution. I don't know how many of you have read articles in the Rhino Time, articles in the Northwest Observer, or even my card. I start out with the First and Second Amendment rights. If I didn't think that these rights were being violated currently, at least by higher power, I wouldn't be here. If I thought we had a sound sheriff in office, I would not be here. I am not running for sheriff for the prestige or for the money. I feel like I have an obligation to make this happen. I don't like what's happening right now. I don't like the fact that our Justice Department is trying to weaponize local law enforcement to trample on your First Amendment rights to free speech. And when I first heard about it, it just made me cringe. When you're speaking out at school boards about your children's education, it really bothered me. So my entire campaign, I'll say more than half of it is based on the Constitution. I think that we're just like Christin, right? Like Christin said, while we're looking over here, they're doing things over there. And before we know it, it's going to be too late. And when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, it was right after they ran the British off from the 13 colonies because they were subjected to this tyranny. And the reason these rules came up, these rights and the Bill of Rights, which was the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, correct me if I'm wrong. But it's not because they just decided to think of these things. is because we had already experienced tyranny, and we can't go back there again. We must have freedom. We must have freedom to speak and live our lives. And I even put in there that I will never allow the sheriff's office to be weaponized to wane away or trounce on your constitutional rights. I said I'm not here for hug a thug. I am here for the law-abiding citizens. Thank you.
You talked about how dear the Constitution was to your heart. How dear is it? How many times have I been here, sat through your class? This is the fourth time. That's how dear it is to me. Every law enforcement agency in the United States of America takes an oath to defend that Constitution. And here in the state of North Carolina, to defend that Constitution here. It's near and dear to my heart. I sat in front of the TVs at nighttime and watch what's going on throughout our country. And I say to myself, how can that happen? We're talking about in violation of the Constitution of the United States. And I tell people, for instance, when plane loads of illegal aliens are being transported into your neighborhoods and dispersed throughout the United States, I can't wait till they come here. When I'm the sheriff, I'll seize that airplane. I will place those pilots under arrest and take control of those illegal aliens. Now, you know why I know I can do that? I was a United States Border Patrol agent. And listen, when I picked you up as a Border Patrol agent, when I was, 2 hours after I picked you up, you were going to be back in Mexico. That's the way that it was. That's the way it should be today. There are two forms that you filled out. One was a personal history form, which you knew that they were lying to you. And you know these people that are coming in here today, they are lying to the Border Patrol agents. We have no idea who they are. And they let them in here. Back then, we didn't really care because we made them sign a VTR, voluntary return to Mexico. I didn't care where you came from. You came across that border in Mexico, you went back. Today, come on in. But we can legally do that, and no one is doing that. The Constitution of the United States has told us what we can do, and it's within those parameters. And if they do that here, when I'm the sheriff, I'll take that airplane. I'll arrest those guys that flew them in here, and I'll take control of those illegal aliens. Now, it's going to be turned over to the United States Attorney's Office. All of it is. And under this administration, they just let them all go. But I have Fox News there taking pictures of it and explaining to the people of the United States of America what they're doing. That's just part of what we can do within the guidance of the Constitution of the United States of America.
This is great. This is like world changing. So I have so many questions that the people in the audience want to ask, and I'm not sure which ones to do. Schools, there aren't very many questions about schools. There was. I gotta find it. All right, let me ask this one and I'll look for the school question, okay? All right, so this one is, if the Fed should mandate the health department or the National Guard or some organization to go door to door vaccinating people or arresting unvaxxed people, what could or would you do as sheriff?
So to that question, I would take a play from some sheriffs from our neighboring state of Virginia that got up and stated that they would deputize every citizen that they could to stand up against the federal government. Because as we've seen before, that's not their power. They don't have that authority and they don't have that right. And as we've seen here, and if you go to my website or my Facebook page, I have said before that we are your last defense against the federal government. And not even just the federal government, against Raleigh. We are your last defense.
if I'm sheriff, that's trespassing. There's to be no legal reason for them to be on your property. There'd be no legal reason for them to be able to vaccinate you against your will. So I don't think that I would have to arm a lot of people when I start putting health workers in jail. I believe that we definitely, I think we could stop that pretty quick. I think we'd be having a lot of conversation and stopping that because I definitely will stand up to your constitutional rights, and I definitely will, as I said before, it works both ways. Sometimes I have to enforce the Constitution, but in most cases, I'm hoping I'm protecting you with the Constitution. So definitely, that would definitely start out with some trespassing charges, and hopefully we could nix that. Wouldn't have to arm everybody for Armageddon.
I like the atmosphere in here. It's great. So this is not a theoretical, right? This has actually happened. So I'm sure most of you remember when the pandemic first started up, there were law enforcement lined up in the middle of the street, stopping you, maybe not you in particular, but stopping you just because you didn't live in the area. You couldn't travel there. You were not allowed to travel there. And same thing happens now. Where's your vaccination card? So this is not theoretical. This has happened. This is here. This is real. So simple answer. What would I do? I'm not going to be in the office. I'll stand in their way. I'll be out in the field with the boots, and I will be in their way to stop them.
I'll say the same thing that Mr. White just indicated. But unless they declare martial law, I can't understand how they would be able to do that. So, but I know they're bordering on that right now, but still, that's not going to happen if I'm your sheriff. Like I said, I think it's really government overreach, and they're already overreaching anyway, but this is a giant leap. So no, that will not happen if I'm your sheriff at all. I promise you.
Well, everybody needs to understand the governor, the mayor, the city council, the county commissioners, they can mandate all day long. They can put in rules, regulations, directives, but they're not legislative laws. They cannot call law enforcement to enforce that stuff. They will not do it here in Guilford County if I am the sheriff. Simple as that.
I wish I was living in Guilford County. So I found a school question. I found two, so hopefully this is the one you were speaking of. This is, will you uphold the rights of parents and tell the public the truth about what is going on in our schools, or will you do as the schools tell you?
So I know that I think the big thing that we're seeing in Guilford County is that our schools aren't safe right now. Last year, we had people just walk in our schools and assault a student for no reason. And even if there was a reason, it's uncalled for. And one thing that we see is that there's a problem. So I work for a small agency, a small town, and that town has about 3,000 residents. If we look at Northwest High School, just take Northwest High School, they have more students and faculty there than my town does. My town has 8 officers to secure that town. We have 1 SRO. So we need to make sure that our schools are safe, they are secure for our students and for our faculty. And I believe the question is, are we going to defend the right for you to petition our school board and make them let you know what they're doing? Yes. Everything I've seen that they've been talking about in the news, there's no violation of the law. You have the right that is given to us in the First Amendment to petition your government. And that's what the school board is. So before we just start pulling people out of the school board, we'll stand there with you and make sure your voice is heard in front of them.
I absolutely believe in the transparency of our schools that we do not have. I was fortunate enough to work at the central office for 4 years as the school resource coordinator for Guilford County Sheriff's Office, High Point Police, and Greensboro Police. I've went head to head with the principals. I went to school board meetings more often than I care to name. One thing we need is we need a sheriff at every school board meeting. And I'm not talking about the captain level that I was. We need the sheriff in the school board meeting. I know what goes on in the schools. I have went head to head with the principals. I had a principal, I won't name who she is, but after the breaking down and crying in the office in front of all the assistant principals and me threatening to take the SRO out of the school and let her explain it to the superintendent, which was Mo Green, she didn't want to meet with me anymore because I was condescending and I was demeaning. And that's exact words that the executive officers have told me. It's because we got problems in our schools. We've got fights in our schools. We got weapons in our schools. We got drugs in our schools. But a school wants to look good, each one of them. We got 126 schools in Guilford County public schools, under Guilford County schools. It's a lot of schools. And we want to always make our school look better than the other school. And that's why you have so many offenses that are hidden. There's 17 reportable offenses that principals can be charged with in North Carolina. That's mandated by state law. 17 offenses must be reported. There's a lot of that don't get reported. A lot of times you can't prove it's reported, but I can tell you this. When I was a captain in the school resource officers program, I told every officer, anytime we have a violation, I will make the charge. You don't have to make it. You have to work with your principals. You have to work with your staff. But I will gladly go to the master's office and I'll make the charge against the principal. Here's the deal. We have to have the elected official to go to the school board meetings. I know that because as a captain, I likely could have been fired for what I would have said, for what I would have done in a school board meeting. But I can tell you as your sheriff, I will stand up on the desk and nobody's going to arrest me in a school board meeting. And I can tell you this too, that there will be transparency in our schools. I will fight as hard as I can to expose every single incident that comes up in a school. My kids went to public school. I have a grandson that's in Pleasant Garden right now, elementary school. I want my kids safe. I want your kids safe, and they can be. But we have to have a public official that's not appointed and is not part of the program to stand up and be at these meetings, not going home at 5 o'clock. And I can promise you this, I will be to school board meetings.
Stephanie, I'm going out on a limb, and I think this was your question. But so I have 2 school-age children right now. One's probably going to be in school next year. And embarrassing enough, it was my school, Southern Guilford, that they ran into. 9 people walked into the school. Nobody stopped them, and they beat a student while school was active. School was going on. If that were my child, I'd be going to somebody's ass, and that's the bottom line. That will not happen to your children. That will not happen to my children, and there's no place for it. We ask these teachers to take care of our kids for 8 hours a day, more than we see them sometimes. The last thing they need to worry about is somebody running in their school. Our kids are there for an education. They're not there to get assaulted. They're not there to go in there and get pregnant or do drugs or anything like that. They're there to get an education. And SROs are under attack right now. If you do not know a school resource officer, they are under attack right now. Guilford County does not want them there. It's up to the sheriff's office to work with those schools and show the need for them. And I can tell you this right now, there's more that goes on in those schools than you might think. The classification system for those schools, like let's say there's a fight, an aggravated assault, classified as ag-ass. What happens is it's dropped down to a simple assault or something that will not be reportable. And so much more goes on than you know about. Unfortunately, in cahoots with the school board, that's been allowed for years, and that's not okay. I'll end on this. Our schools, one of the big issues right now is violence, and it's not inside the school; it's from outside the school. A shooter comes in, or somebody wants to cause harm to the school. The Guilford County Sheriff's Office will not be the Broward Coward. We will go, I don't care if you're day one on the job or it's your last day before you retire. You will go in that school, and if it requires you dying to protect your children, my children, your friends and family that are faculty there, they will do it. And if they do not do it, they will have no place working for the Guilford County Sheriff's Office.
You know, my campaign has ran on 4 main topics, and so far, this is the 3rd topic that I stand on. It's almost like you guys read my mind. Now, our schools are not safe, and I think we should not be pinching pennies when it comes to security of our children. I can't understand this. We can provide security, all sorts of security for congressmen and senators and the president and Fortune 500 companies, but we down to 1 SRO to 11 or 1,200 students. And this one officer is supposed to watch all internal and external threats. He can't do it. And my position has been to advocate for at least double, and hopefully we can triple the amount of SROs into the schools. Now, that is not the sheriff's authority to make this happen, but he can make enough noise to where he cannot be ignored. And the school board would have to at least capitulate to some degree and make it happen. These are our children. And we got 1 officer in a school. That's unacceptable. Now, as far as the school board, I hope I understood the question. What will we do if the school board, I'm sorry, can you repeat it? Certainly not the latter. The parents need to be involved in the children's education. You need to have a say in the children's education. It should not be, as our Attorney General has suggested, because his son has created this program or this criteria dealing with CRT, and because of that, he wants to identify those parents that oppose it. This is tyranny. This is wrong. This goes against the core of the Constitution. You know, if you stood up on a desk like Mr. Byrd just said and want to shout to the top of your lungs at a school board meeting, I can promise you my deputies will never arrest you. Thank you.
You know, I wish that it was just that simple, that we have SROs in our schools. And I say that because when I was a kid going to school, we didn't have cops at the schools. We didn't have concertina wire. We didn't have magnetometers, dogs, disrespect. Something happened. Something happened to us where now we do have to have cops in the school. And I have to say this, when they took God out of school, they replaced it with all of that stuff that you're talking about. And ditto, I will be the first one on top of the desk, tap dancing, to defend your right to scream your lungs out if you want to at that school board meeting. Now, thank God Contreras is gone. And listen, if she's still here on your way out the door, hug Stephanie Mitchell.
Okay, so I think we're going to conclude with one last question. I want to kind of shift gears a little bit. There's some questions in the pile that touch on this, so I'm going to try to articulate it. If there is a situation like there has been over the past couple of years where there's riots or a lot of things happening in the city, right? And it's within your jurisdiction and the city PD is not keeping the peace, would you, as the keeper of the peace in your jurisdiction, come to enforce the law, or what would your response be in that situation?
So I actually have a little bit of firsthand knowledge with this a little bit. So when the riots were taking place in Greensboro, or I'm sorry, the mostly peaceful protests that they called them, I was working for Alamance County Sheriff's Office. And the same day that they were occurring in Greensboro, that they were protesting in Greensboro, I got a call and was told I had to be at the office in an hour because they were protesting in downtown Graham. And the sheriff in Alamance County said, it's not happening here. And when I tried to leave Greensboro and go to my job, it took me an extra 30 minutes to get there because of how the roads were blocked. It didn't just take me that. I had a coworker that called me and told me that if she was late, it was because of this. And that is uncalled for. We have the right to protest, but if we read those clauses in there, we don't have the right to stop people from doing their jobs and stop people's businesses from occurring. So, and if at any time, High Point, Greensboro, or even Little Gibsonville, or part of Burlington, or the part of Kernersville that comes in, if they want to do any of that in Guilford County, they can protest all they want. But the time that they start getting in the streets and they block our ways of travel and motion, every one of them will go to jail. I don't care if we don't have room, we'll put them somewhere, because that is uncalled for and disrespectful to every other citizen in the county.
That question is the reason I'm running for sheriff. Will made my decision. 2020, if I was sheriff, would never happen in Greensboro, would never happen. The things that happen and tearing up businesses and setting the courthouse on fire, running people's property that can't open back up, and they knew that was going to happen. When the buses rolled in, the buses would have kept rolling. I would have met with Nancy Vaughn. I would have met with the city attorney, and what I would have told them as quickly as this. If you're going to have your officers stand down, and I respect a lot of Greensboro police officers, there's a lot of great police officers in Greensboro. I don't blame any law enforcement officer for the inactions. I blame the leadership. My statement would have been to this: if you want them to stand down, please stand to the side. I'll bring 150 deputies in. The first match is lit, the first rock is thrown, I will have the Department of Correction buses loaded up. If it takes me 2 weeks to go through citations and let them use the bathroom while we do citations, that's what we would do. But I can tell you that was the switch that flipped when I saw our sheriff that was not qualified in the first place to take that office. He didn't have the character. He had the lack of experience. He should have never been in that position. We got what we've got voted in. So in 2020, I feel sorry for the businesses because the wrong sheriff was in office. Because the right sheriff would have been in, Nancy Vaughn would have ate crow.
So I'd just like to point out two different scenarios. January 6th in D.C., and then when your city was torn to the ground. In D.C., a young lady was shot to death, unarmed. And in Greensboro, you know what we did? We walked away. We completely left the area. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Friendly Center. It was vandalized and businesses were torn down and stuff was stolen, and we walked away. We let them do it. But in D.C., we didn't protect their right to protest. We killed somebody, an unarmed person. So unarmed, that's right. That's right. Yeah, a vet. We killed a vet. So we're going to protect people's right to protest, because one day that may be me and you out there. You know, we never know. But one thing that we will not do, and I was on the riot team in Greensboro. I actually even caused a riot. I arrested Rick Ross one time at Super Jams in Greensboro, and downtown started a riot. So I've been there, done it. There's many laws that cover riots. Not just one. It's not just, hey, you're standing in the street. There's a litany of laws. That anything from you can't carry sticks, you can't be out at this certain time. There's all kinds of laws that you can enforce against these riots. And we've done it before. However, 2 years ago, we stopped doing it. We stopped doing it because we were scared and because we do not understand the Constitution. We do not understand our role, and we do not understand what the people want because we're so blind to the fact of what the people want. They're crying out, their businesses are being torn down, their lives are being lost, and we back away, and we back away. That won't happen with us. We will line up. If somebody's standing in the street causing you any danger, they'll go to jail. We will line up and protect what is yours. You have my promise on that. I've done it before, and we will do it again.
This is another one of my topics I stand on, and since I've came out with my announcement that, especially against BLM, I've been hit with a lot of backlash, but I can take it. Now, I don't have a problem with protesting. Peaceful protest on either side. It doesn't matter to me. You have a right to your First Amendment, freedom of speech. But if you think because of your color of your skin that you get out here and destroy property and loot and burn buildings, that will not happen on my watch. I don't care what color you are. Now, certain people have been given a pass. I'm sure you guys heard about this guy who drove his car through the parade, killed a lot of people. All of a sudden, you don't really see that in the news. But then you contrast that with that guy with the rifle trying to defend the car lot, but he's all over the news as a bad person. It's really lopsided. In Guilford County, I will not let that happen. I promise you. I don't care what color you are. I will take care of business. Thank you.
You're having to put up with that color thing? Imagine being an ATF agent answering the Second Amendment questions out here. You know, the problem is systemic over there in Greensboro right now with the city council that's over there. And it's not just the city council. It's the DA's office over there too. There's a problem in both of those offices over there. And that's the reason, or that's a big reason, together with the leadership of the Guilford County Sheriff's Department, has now turned Greensboro into the most dangerous city to live in the state of North Carolina. And I've been thinking about that. And if we have to, unfortunately, all of us, when I say that, Greensboro, High Point, the Sheriff's Department are critically short of personnel right now. And that's for a number of reasons, but we're going to correct that. And when we do correct that, if we have to go into Greensboro to do the Greensboro PD's job for them, we'll do it, and we'll send the city council the bill.
Well, thank you all very much. So all of you have a web page, correct? Will you answer questions there that we didn't get to? Okay. You have questions we didn't get to? Send it to their email on their web page. Adam Moore, Phil Bird, William White, Edward Melvin, Billy Queen. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Please don't forget to sign up. Please don't forget to see Misty with Hopeful Wellness. If you need to get some ivermectin, she can get you ivermectin. Go see her.